Debt is a strange thing. It's invisible, abstract, made of nothing but promises and confidence, yet it quietly reshapes entire civilizations. It builds cities, powers armies, fuels innovation, and lifts nations into golden ages. But it also haunts them. Every empire, from ancient Mesopotamia to modern superpowers, has eventually asked the same uncomfortable question: how much debt is too much? And almost every time, the answer came too late. We're taught to believe that debt is a tool, something neutral, manageable, even beneficial. But what if that belief is the very illusion that drives collapse? What if debt doesn't just accompany the fall of civilizations, but engineers them from within? Today, we follow the story of how debt became humanity's quiet engine of expansion, and its even quieter engine of destruction. The story begins long before credit cards and central banks. Before governments regulated currencies or financial markets existed. It starts in ancient fields of grain, in temples and clay tablets, in societies where the concept of money itself barely existed. And yet, even then, something was forming, a cycle of obligation and escalation that humanity would never learn to escape. In ancient Sumer, more than 4,000 years ago, debt wasn't a private matter. It was the backbone of society. Farmers borrowed grain from temples to plant their fields. Shepherds borrowed livestock. Traders borrowed silver. Debt was normal, expected, even celebrated as a civic duty. But the early Sumerians discovered something we still struggle with: debt expands faster than the real world. A bad harvest, a failed season, a political conflict, and suddenly borrowers owed more than they could ever repay. The consequences were devastating. Families lost their land, their freedom, even their children. Entire classes of people fell into debt bondage. The economy froze as the poor sank deeper and the wealthy tightened their grip. Civil unrest rose. And every few decades, the same pattern repeated. The Sumerian solution? Something almost unimaginable today: debt forgiveness. Kings would declare emargy, or freedom, wiping the slate clean. It wasn't an act of generosity. It was self-preservation. Kings understood that without intervention, debt would consume the kingdom from within. A society where citizens were enslaved by creditors simply couldn't function. It's one of the earliest signs of a pattern that repeats across history: debt grows naturally, quietly, relentlessly, until society itself becomes the collateral. As centuries passed, civilizations became more sophisticated. Empires rose, currencies stabilized, legal codes emerged. But debt didn't disappear. It evolved. The Roman Empire, for instance, built extraordinary wealth on conquest, trade, taxes, and credit. Roman elites developed complex lending systems, charging interest rates that would make modern bankers blush. Debt fueled expansion. It also fueled inequality. Small farmers, the backbone of early Rome, borrowed to survive. When crops failed or wars kept them from home, lenders seized their land. Over time, vast estates formed, owned by a tiny aristocratic class. Ordinary Romans, displaced and impoverished, flooded the cities seeking work. Many ended up in slums. Others joined the growing ranks of the debt-dependent. As the gap widened, Rome relied increasingly on the spoils of conquest to keep the economy afloat. Conquest wasn't just about glory, it was about paying the bills. New lands meant new slaves, new gold, new resources to offset the growing internal imbalance. But once Rome ran out of easy conquests, its financial foundation cracked. Internal debts mounted. The economy stagnated. The empire that once dominated the world found itself unable to support the very system it had created. The Romans didn't call it a debt crisis, but their historians wrote of corruption, excess, and the slow decay of the middle class, a familiar story hidden in ancient words. Debt didn't appear on the battlefield, but it was there, quietly shaping the fate of the empire. After Rome fell, medieval Europe tried something different. The church condemned usury, the charging of excessive interest. Lending became moral territory, not just financial. But prohibition didn't stop debt. It only drove lending into new forms. Monarchs borrowed from merchants. Merchants borrowed from each other. Wars were financed by promises. Trade expanded on credit alone. By the Renaissance, European powers were borrowing so heavily that entire banking families like the Medici and the Fuggers effectively became shadow governments. States rose or fell depending on whether their creditors believed in them. Wars were lost not when armies failed, but when credit dried up. And then came the modern world, where debt scaled faster than anyone could have predicted. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Machines increased productivity, and governments began borrowing heavily to build infrastructure. Railroads, ports, factories, and canals were all financed by loans. Debt no longer seemed like a burden, it was the fuel of progress. Economists developed theories that framed debt as harmless, even necessary. The more an economy grew, the more it could borrow. The more it borrowed, the more it grew. It was a self-reinforcing loop, a perpetual motion machine, or at least it appeared to be. In the early 20th century, industrial powers embraced debt with unprecedented enthusiasm. World War I was financed almost entirely on credit. When the bill came due in the 1920s, nations struggled to pay. Germany's hyperinflation, America's booming stock market, Britain's unstable gold standard, all were symptoms of a deeper imbalance. Then came 1929. The global financial system collapsed under the weight of speculation and leverage. Debt had grown faster than the real economy again, and when confidence broke, everything unraveled. Factories closed. Banks failed. Governments panicked. And ordinary people who had taken loans to buy homes, cars, and stocks suddenly found themselves trapped in an economic nightmare. The Great Depression wasn't just a crash. It was a revelation. It showed how quickly the illusion of prosperity can disappear when debt outpaces reality. It also showed how interconnected the world had become. A crisis in one corner of the financial system could ripple across continents. To prevent a repeat, governments created new regulations. Deposit insurance. Central banking policies. Stimulus programs. Safety nets. These tools helped stabilize economies, but they also introduced something new, the idea that debt could always be managed by policy. That collapse could be prevented through intervention. But over the next century, something unexpected happened. Instead of reducing reliance on debt, societies leaned into it even harder. After World War II, consumer credit exploded. Mortgages, car loans, student loans, credit cards, debt became a normal part of everyday life. Governments borrowed to build highways, fund schools, expand healthcare, and support the military. Corporations borrowed to acquire competitors, automate factories, and speculate on financial markets. By the 1970s, the United States took a radical step, breaking the link between currency and gold. It wasn't just a monetary policy shift. It opened the door to unlimited creation of money through debt. Without a physical constraint like gold, the financial system became a vast ocean of abstract promises, bonds, derivatives, mortgages, and digital credits that could multiply endlessly. Throughout the late 20th century, debt levels rose in almost every category. Household debt, corporate debt, government debt, global debt. Each crisis, from the Latin American debt collapse in the 1980s to the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s, revealed the fragility of the system. Yet each time, the solution was the same: more debt, cheaper debt, faster debt. Like a stimulant that masks exhaustion while deepening it. Then came 2008, the most dramatic financial collapse of the modern era. At its core was the same ancient pattern: debt outpacing the real economy. Banks lent money to people who couldn't repay. Those loans were bundled, repackaged, and sold as safe investments. When homeowners defaulted, the system cracked. Major banks failed. Stock markets plunged. Governments intervened with massive bailouts. But here's the twist: instead of resetting the system, the aftermath accelerated it. Interest rates dropped to historic lows. Central banks injected unprecedented amounts of money into markets. Debt became cheaper and more appealing than ever. The world entered what many economists now call the everything bubble, a period where nearly every asset class rose not because of real productivity, but because of abundant cheap debt. Housing, stocks, bonds, even cryptocurrencies all surged. Today, global debt stands at levels ancient civilizations could never have imagined. Trillions upon trillions of dollars in sovereign debt, corporate bonds, consumer loans, and financial derivatives circulate through the global economy. In many countries, debt now exceeds several times the size of the entire national economy. And yet, few people question it. Debt is no longer seen as dangerous. It's seen as normal, expected, necessary. But beneath that surface of confidence lies a familiar tension, the same tension felt by Sumerian farmers, Roman citizens, medieval monarchs, and early industrialists. Debt is easy to accumulate, harder to repay, and nearly impossible to reduce without consequences. The mathematics haven't changed. Compounding interest still grows faster than economic output. Obligations still pile up silently. And at some point, something has to give. The question isn't whether debt will trigger future instability. The question is when, where, and how. Some countries already feel the strain. Japan's debt to GDP ratio exceeds 250%, supported only by aggressive central bank intervention. The United States carries over $34 trillion in federal debt, with projections rising sharply. China's property sector, once a symbol of unstoppable growth, now struggles under massive borrowing. Emerging economies face rising interest payments that consume budgets and limit development. At the household level, many families live paycheck to paycheck, burdened by mortgages, medical bills, student loans, and credit card balances. At the corporate level, billions in debt must be refinanced each year at higher interest rates. At the national level, governments increasingly rely on borrowing to fund essential services rather than investment. If history teaches us anything, it's that debt doesn't need to cause an immediate collapse. It causes gradual fragility, a slow erosion of resilience. Systems appear stable until one unexpected shock reveals how fragile they truly are. A pandemic. A war. A trade disruption. A spike in energy prices. A political crisis. Any major disruption can expose the underlying imbalance. And when confidence breaks, when creditors lose faith, the consequences can move quickly. Markets crash. Banks tighten lending. Businesses lay off workers. Governments scramble for emergency measures. The cycle feeds on itself. This is the quiet engine of collapse, not a single catastrophic event, but a slow accumulation of pressure that becomes impossible to ignore. But collapse is not inevitable. History also shows that societies can adapt, reform, and reset. The Sumerians used debt jubilees. Medieval Europe reinvented financial structures. Modern nations created regulatory systems to stabilize markets. Each era found ways to confront the spiraling growth of obligations. The question now is what lessons we will choose to learn. The first lesson is that debt and growth are not the same. Borrowing can stimulate progress, but it cannot replace real productivity. When debt grows faster than output, the imbalance becomes unsustainable. For individuals and nations alike, understanding the difference between temporary leverage and long-term value is essential. The second lesson is that inequality and debt are deeply connected. As wealth concentrates, ordinary people rely more on borrowing to maintain living standards. Over time, this creates a society built not on shared prosperity, but on widespread obligation. Every major civilization that ignored this imbalance eventually paid the price. The third lesson is that transparency matters. Many of the world's largest financial risks come not from visible debt but from hidden obligations, derivatives, shadow banking, off-book liabilities, and political promises. The more opaque the system becomes, the harder it is to manage. Civilizations collapse not just because they borrow too much, but because they fail to understand what they borrowed. As we reflect on the past, one truth stands out: debt is not merely an economic tool. It is a psychological force, a political instrument, and a societal habit. It amplifies both ambition and vulnerability. It brings out the best and the worst in humanity. And once set in motion, it rarely slows down on its own. So the real question, the one each generation must face, is simple: who controls the debt, and who is controlled by it? If this exploration has deepened your understanding of how debt shapes civilizations, consider sharing your thoughts. What patterns do you see today that mirror the past? What warnings should we pay attention to? And what lessons should we carry forward? If you want to dive deeper into the hidden forces shaping history, economics, and society, feel free to subscribe and join the discussion. The more we understand the quiet engines driving our world, the better prepared we become to shape what comes next.